Everything is connected. Nothing is random.
There are crimes that don't make sense from the beginning. No motive, no witnesses, no clear perpetrator. Just silence and questions and evidence that leads nowhere. In the early 1990s, an elderly woman was found dead in her home in a quiet industrial town in Western Europe. The front door was locked from the inside. There were no signs of forced entry. No neighbors heard anything unusual. She had been strangled. The scene was methodical, careful, almost clinical in its lack of disturbance. Whoever did this left almost nothing behind. Investigators searched the home for days. They dusted every surface, photographed every angle, bagged every object that might hold a trace of the killer. But fingerprints were absent. Fibers were generic. Blood belonged only to the victim. The only usable evidence came from a common household object near the body. A single cotton swab was used to collect trace material. When the sample reached the forensic laboratory, technicians extracted a DNA profile. It was clean, complete, usable. And it belonged to an unknown woman. Investigators ran the profile through every available database. No match, no criminal record, no prior contact with law enforcement. The woman in the DNA was a ghost. The case went cold. Years passed. The file was archived, but never closed. The DNA profile remained in the system, waiting. What no one realized at the time was that this single piece of evidence would reappear, not once, not twice, but dozens of times, in crime scenes scattered across borders, across years, across contexts that made no logical sense. The same genetic signature, the same unknown woman. And with each new appearance, investigators became more convinced they were hunting someone real. At first, none of these cases seemed related.
Case 1. The unexplained murder. The town where the first murder occurred was the kind of place where people didn't lock their doors. Small, industrial, predictable. The victim had lived there for decades. She was retired, widowed, known to her neighbors as polite, but private. On a Tuesday morning, a mail carrier noticed her front gate was open. Unusual, but not alarming. He knocked, no answer. He returned the next day, still no answer. On the third day, he contacted the local police. Officers entered through the back door. They found her in the living room, positioned near the sofa. The medical examiner estimated she had been dead for at least 3 days. Cause of death: asphyxiation due to manual strangulation. What made the case unusual wasn't just the lack of evidence, it was the absence of logic. Nothing was stolen. The home wasn't ransacked. There was no sign of a struggle. Whoever killed her had done so quickly, quietly, and with purpose. But what purpose? Detectives interviewed everyone in the neighborhood. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The victim had no known enemies, no disputes, no debts. Her daily routine was consistent and unremarkable. She went to the market twice a week. She attended a local community center on Thursdays. There was nothing in her life that suggested violence. The only clue came from the forensic team. A sample collected from a water glass on a side table yielded a DNA profile. The profile was clear: female, not the victim. Investigators believed it belonged to the killer. They ran it through the national database. Nothing. They expanded the search to neighboring countries. Still nothing. The DNA belonged to someone who had never been arrested, never been fingerprinted, never been identified by any law enforcement agency. The investigation stalled. Leads dried up. The case was moved to the cold case unit, where it joined dozens of other unsolved files.
But the DNA profile remained active in the system, a silent witness, waiting to speak again. What investigators didn't know was that the same profile had already appeared elsewhere, in a completely different context, in a crime that had nothing to do with murder. And soon, it would appear again.
5 years later, in another region several hundred kilometers away, a man was found dead in his apartment. The circumstances were different. The victim was younger, male, living alone in a densely populated urban area. He had been struck on the head with a blunt object. The scene showed signs of a brief struggle. Furniture was overturned. A lamp was shattered. But again, nothing of value was taken. Forensic technicians collected samples from multiple surfaces. A cotton swab was used to gather trace material from the door handle. When the sample was processed, the laboratory extracted a DNA profile. And when that profile was run through the database, something unexpected happened. It matched. The profile was identical to the one recovered 5 years earlier from the strangled woman's home. Same genetic markers, same sequence, no ambiguity. The match was exact. Investigators reviewed both case files side by side. 2 victims, different genders, different ages, different cities. One lived in a quiet town, the other in a crowded metropolitan area. The crimes were separated by years and distance, but the DNA told a different story. The conclusion seemed unavoidable. The same person had been present at both crime scenes. A woman, unknown, unidentified, and now officially a suspect in at least 2 violent deaths. A task force was assembled. Detectives from both regions began coordinating their efforts. They built a timeline, they mapped locations, they searched for overlaps. Was there any connection between the 2 victims? Had they ever crossed paths? The answer was no. The victims had lived entirely separate lives. They had no mutual acquaintances, no shared employment history, no common interests. There was nothing that linked them, except the DNA. Forensic experts were brought in to review the evidence. They confirmed the match. They assured investigators that the probability of a coincidental match was astronomically low. The DNA was reliable. The science was sound. The same woman had been at both scenes. But who was she? And why was she killing people who seemed to have nothing in common? The investigation shifted. Resources were redirected. A profile was constructed based on the limited information available. Female, likely between the ages of 25 and 50. Mobile, capable of traveling between regions. Comfortable moving through different social environments. The press began to take notice. Headlines appeared in regional newspapers. Unknown woman linked to 2 murders. Police search for female serial suspect. The public was warned to remain vigilant. But despite the attention, despite the resources, despite the certainty of the DNA evidence, no suspect was identified. No photograph, no name, no sighting. The woman remained invisible. And then her DNA appeared again.
Case 3. The Contradictions. Over the next several years, the same DNA profile began appearing in contexts that made less and less sense. A burglary in a suburban home. Trace material recovered from a window frame. The DNA matched. A stolen vehicle abandoned in a parking lot. A swab taken from the steering wheel. The DNA matched. And assault in a public park. Evidence collected from a discarded object nearby. The DNA matched. Each time, forensic technicians confirmed the results. Same profile, same woman, but the crimes were scattered. Geographically, temporally, behaviorally. Some incidents involved violence, others involved theft. Some were opportunistic, others seemed calculated. There was no pattern, no consistent method, no predictable interval, no clear motive. Criminal psychologists were consulted. They reviewed the case files and tried to construct a behavioral profile,
But every model they built fell apart under scrutiny. The suspect's actions were too inconsistent, too contradictory. How could the same person commit a brutal murder in one instance and then shoplift weeks later in a different city? How could someone move so freely across borders without ever being seen? Why were there no eyewitnesses, no CCTV footage, no digital trail? Investigators began to wonder if they were dealing with someone exceptionally intelligent, someone who understood forensic science, someone who knew how to avoid detection, or perhaps someone with access to resources that allowed them to vanish at will. The investigation expanded. International cooperation was initiated. Law enforcement agencies in multiple countries began sharing information. The DNA profile was distributed widely, and still, the woman could not be found. Her genetic signature appeared in crime scenes across Western Europe, but she herself remained a phantom. Detectives interviewed thousands of people. They followed leads that went nowhere. They chased shadows. At the time, no one questioned the evidence itself. The DNA was treated as fact, unimpeachable, objective, scientific. If the DNA said she was there, then she was there. The only question was, who was she?
By the early 2000s, the case had grown into something unprecedented. More than 40 crime scenes, multiple countries, years of investigation, and still no suspect. The media began calling her the Phantom Woman. Others referred to her as the ghost suspect. The story captured public attention across Europe. How could one person be linked to so many crimes and yet remain completely invisible? Law enforcement held press conferences. They appealed to the public for information. They released details about the DNA profile, hoping someone would recognize a pattern or remember a face. Nothing came forward. Internally, frustration was mounting. Detectives had dedicated years to the investigation. They had followed every protocol, pursued every lead, exhausted every resource, and yet they were no closer to an arrest than they had been at the beginning. Some investigators began to develop theories that bordered on the bizarre. Was the suspect using disguises? Was she part of a larger organization? Was there more than one person involved? Others suggested she might have died, and the DNA was being left behind by someone else who had access to her personal items. But none of these theories held up. The DNA was too consistent, too widespread, too persistent. It kept appearing in new locations, in new contexts, long after any plausible explanation could account for it. Forensic laboratories were asked to retest samples. The results came back the same. The profile was accurate, the procedures had been followed correctly. There was no contamination, no mishandling, no error. Or so they believed. What investigators didn't know was that the error had occurred long before the samples ever reached a laboratory. It had occurred before the crimes were even committed, before the swabs were ever used. The DNA they were chasing didn't belong to a killer. It belonged to someone who had never committed a crime, someone who had no idea their genetic material was traveling across Europe, appearing in case after case, year after year. Someone who worked in a factory, packaging forensic supplies.
The first crack in the case didn't involve a crime at all. A routine forensic training exercise was being conducted at a police academy. Students were learning how to collect and process evidence from a simulated crime scene. During the exercise, samples were collected using standard cotton swabs. The samples were processed in a controlled laboratory environment. When the results came back, something impossible appeared: the Phantom Woman's DNA. But the training scene was entirely artificial. No actual crime had occurred. The only people present were instructors and students, all of whom had been vetted and cataloged. None of them matched the profile. The discovery was reported to the lead investigators. At first, it was dismissed as a clerical error. Perhaps the samples had been mislabeled. Perhaps there had been contamination in the lab. But when the test was repeated, the result was the same. For the first time, investigators began to ask a different question.
Not who is this woman, but where is this DNA actually coming from? A review was initiated. Forensic protocols were examined. Chain of custody was scrutinized. Laboratory procedures were audited. Everything appeared to be in order, except for one detail. Someone noticed that the same brand of cotton swabs had been used in nearly every case where the phantom woman's DNA had appeared. The swabs were mass-produced, packaged in sterile sealed containers, distributed widely across law enforcement agencies throughout Europe. They were considered standard issue, trusted, reliable, sterile. But were they? A request was made to test unused swabs directly from their packaging. Swabs that had never been opened, never touched, never used. When those swabs were analyzed, the DNA appeared again, the phantom woman's profile, on unused, supposedly sterile forensic collection tools. The realization hit like a shockwave. The DNA had never come from a crime scene. It had been there from the beginning, embedded in the very tools used to collect evidence.
An investigation was launched into the manufacturing process. The swabs were produced at a facility in Central Europe. The company specialized in medical and forensic supplies. Their products were used by hospitals, laboratories, and law enforcement agencies across the continent. The swabs were labeled as sterile. They were sealed in individual packets, processed in controlled environments, certified for forensic use. But sterile had a specific meaning in the industry. It meant free from bacteria and viruses. It did not mean free from human DNA. During the packaging process, workers handled the swabs with gloved hands. But gloves are not impermeable. Microscopic skin cells can transfer, sweat can seep through, traces of DNA can be left behind. And once that DNA is embedded in the cotton fibers of a swab, it becomes nearly impossible to remove. Investigators traced the contamination back to a single worker at the packaging facility, a woman in her 30s. She had worked at the factory for years. Her job was to inspect and package forensic collection kits. She had no criminal record, no connection to any of the crimes. She was ordinary, unremarkable, and her DNA had traveled across Europe, appearing in crime scenes she would never visit, linking crimes she would never commit. Thousands of swabs had been contaminated. They had been distributed to police departments, forensic laboratories, and crime scene investigation units throughout multiple countries. Each time one of those swabs was used to collect evidence, the woman's DNA was introduced into the sample. The crimes were real. The victims were real. But the connection between them was not. The phantom woman didn't exist. She had never killed anyone, never stolen anything, never committed a single crime. She had simply gone to work each day, unaware that her genetic material was being used to construct a fictional serial criminal. Every case file had to be reopened. Every DNA match had to be reevaluated. Decades of investigative work had been built on a foundation that was fundamentally flawed. Some cases were solved once the contaminated evidence was removed. Other suspects were identified. New leads emerged. But many cases remained unsolved. The real perpetrators had gone undetected for years while investigators chased a ghost. The woman from the factory was interviewed. She was confused, frightened, horrified to learn what had happened. She had done nothing wrong. She had simply worked her job. And yet, her DNA had become the cornerstone of one of the largest investigative failures in modern forensic history.
The revelation sent shockwaves through the forensic community. DNA evidence had been considered the gold standard of modern criminal investigation. Objective, scientific, infallible. But this case exposed a critical flaw. The technology was only as reliable as the assumptions behind it. Investigators had assumed that sterile meant DNA-free. They had assumed that contamination could only occur during collection or analysis. They had assumed that if DNA appeared at a crime scene, it must have come from someone who was physically present. All of those assumptions were wrong. Forensic protocols were revised. New standards were implemented for the manufacturing and certification of evidence collection tools. DNA-free certification became a requirement. Random testing of unopened packages became mandatory. But the damage had been done. Years of investigations had been compromised. Convictions were reviewed. Some were overturned. Public trust in forensic science was shaken. Legal scholars began to question how many other cases might have been affected by similar contamination, not just in Europe, but globally. How many other phantom suspects might exist in databases around the world? How many investigations had been misdirected by invisible errors embedded in the tools themselves? The case also raised uncomfortable questions about the nature of evidence. For years, investigators had built entire narratives around a single piece of data. They had constructed timelines, behavioral profiles, and theories of motive based on the presence of DNA. But the DNA had told them nothing. It had been noise, mistaken for signal. What made the case particularly troubling was not malice. There was no conspiracy, no cover-up, no intentional wrongdoing. The error had been systemic. It had occurred because no one thought to question the tools, because everyone trusted the process, because the evidence looked so convincing. And that, perhaps, is the most unsettling lesson. The most dangerous errors are not the ones that are obvious. They are the ones that hide behind authority, behind certification, behind scientific consensus. The ones that no one thinks to question until it's too late. In the end, the phantom woman was never arrested because she was never real. The crimes she was accused of committing were carried out by other people, people who were never caught because investigators were looking in the wrong direction, chasing a profile that pointed nowhere, following evidence that had no meaning.
There is a strange irony in the way this story ends. The woman whose DNA became the focus of one of Europe's most extensive criminal investigations never knew she was being hunted. She went to work each day. She lived her life. She had no idea. When she was finally identified, not as a suspect, but as the source of contamination, her life didn't change. She wasn't charged with anything. She hadn't done anything wrong. Her only crime was existing in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing a job that no one thought could matter. But her DNA mattered. It mattered enough to redirect entire investigations. It mattered enough to create a fictional serial criminal. It mattered enough to shape years of police work across multiple countries. And yet, it meant nothing. This story is a composite narrative inspired by real investigative failures that have occurred in different places and times. The details have been generalized, the locations have been changed, the timeline has been condensed, but the core truth remains. Forensic science is powerful, but it is not infallible. Technology can reveal evidence that was once invisible, but it can also create evidence that was never there. The danger is not in the tools themselves. The danger is in the certainty with which we trust them, in the assumption that science cannot lie, in the belief that if something is measurable, it must be true. Somewhere in an archive, the case files still exist. Decades of investigation, hundreds of pages of reports, thousands of hours of work, all of it built on a single invisible error. And somewhere in a quiet industrial town in Western Europe, an elderly woman's murder remains unsolved, not because the evidence was missing, but because the evidence pointed in the wrong direction. The real killer was never caught. The phantom woman was never found, because she was never there.